Thanks to all our listeners for joining. I am Kate Fishbein. I am here with Tom Farrell. We are according to plan, and we're excited you're here today because we've got a really exciting, important topic that I think comes up a lot. Most individuals save for retirement really through their employer-sponsored plans, oftentimes 401ks. And when you leave those plans, what happens to the money that you've saved? We want to make sure that we're bringing some awareness to this topic and some considerations when you're leaving an employer, have these 401ks, and are trying to decide what to do with those funds.
I was going to say, it's, when you made the comment about, if you change employers, one of the interesting things that you and I found was this website that's been launched by the Department of Labor. And it's interesting. They call it Lost and Found. And it's geared towards, retirement savers who may have changed jobs multiple times. And, in this fast moving economy, I guess it's not that unusual to potentially, forget about an older 401k, and next thing you know, you're moving on to the new company, and you may be saving in that plan, and too busy to think about what you've done with some previously saved dollars.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? They always say one of the three major most stressful times in your life can be changing jobs. So it does come at a kind of maybe chaotic time in your life, thinking about what to do with these funds. And you're right. So it's clearly a prevalent issue that the Department of Labor created this website to help individuals find some of those lost 401k funds. And I think the estimated number of 401k accounts is close to 32 million. So, we're talking about a lot of money that's, held in 401k accounts. So really a very important topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of those things where I think a lot of people are always focused on what's the next thing I'm doing looking forward, which makes sense. Right. And then I think, this is an interesting example of, some of the things that get left behind.
For sure. And now, when an individual is changing jobs and they have a 401k, maybe before we jump into the two options that we're really going to focus on today, maybe we discuss, there's pretty much 4 different things an individual could do with their funds when leaving an employer and, they currently have a 401k plan. One is, if the plan allows to potentially leave that 401k in the old employer, which we'll talk about. Another is kind of rolling it over into the new employer's 401k. Another option would be potentially distributing the funds, which could have tax implications, because if you're taking out pre-tax funds, you're going to owe, federal tax, most likely state tax, and possibly even an early withdrawal fee. And then there's the possibility of rolling it into an IRA rollover as well. So today, keeping it in that 401k vehicle, we wanted to focus on, maybe some of those advantages of why someone might leave funds in a 401k in general. So Tom, do you want to kick us off with, maybe some thinking there and maybe some potential reasons why to leave the funds in a 401k?
Yeah, so there are several advantages, and one of them, if you think about the different types of ways that people save for eventual retirement down the road, and the world we live in terms of litigation, events where people might get sued, and you think about how do I protect assets? Well, the good news is that 401ks have very strong protections provided under federal law, under ERISA. And so if I have dollars in my 401k, I have very strong federal creditor protection. So this is something where, you may be living your life and, nothing's happening and you don't feel like, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to have some sort of a creditor issue. But it is important to know that if you do have dollars in 401ks, those assets do have strong creditor protection under the federal ERISA laws, and it's something to keep in mind. Just as if you're kind of thinking through that matrix of decisions that you just talked about, Kate, right?
Sure.
This could be something where, as long as you have this knowledge, it can help you make some of these decisions, whether you want to leave something in a 401k or make some other type of a decision.
Right. And so that's really on the creditor protection side. We're not attorneys, but so on the creditor protection side, doesn't mean that completely insulates you from, everything, right? There could obviously, there's still potential to have to split assets because of divorce, maybe tax liens, or other maybe civil issues. But from the creditor protection standpoint, it does offer that, more generous protection.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit too, because rollover IRAs, we'll get into that too, but rollover IRAs do offer similar protection as long as it's from that qualified employer, funds. So, another reason to consider is 401ks, depending on the plan, can sometimes offer the ability for employees to take a loan against their 401k. Whereas IRAs don't allow this provision, right? You can't just borrow, you can't margin an IRA account, you can't borrow against an IRA account. So that might be one reason that you might consider leaving funds in the 401k. But you really got to think about the plan, because oftentimes with those 401k loans, they're often being paid back through payroll. So if you're terminating service, this may or may not be a feature that is still allowed. So really, that's the crazy thing too, Tom, right? Is that plans are all specific.
Right.
And so there are different things that are allowed in some plans that are allowed in others. So it's really knowing your individual plan, working with your plan administrator to know the features of the plan and what's allowed and what isn't.
Yeah, there's a lot of these, general rules when it comes to 401ks, and you may hear them and read about them in articles and things like that. But yeah, to your point, and for the most part, the ones that I've come across in my career, most of these plan documents do allow for a loan provision, right? But it is plan specific. There's some plans that just don't allow it. They don't want, let's say they don't want to deal with, the administrative aspects of, loans for participants and things like that. So you do want to check about that before you would explore borrowing from a 401k. And then you do make a good point about the fact that, how these work. You're typically doing this while you're still working for that particular employer because of how the repayments are made, right, through payroll. And that's typically over a specified period of time, and there's an interest rate that gets quoted when you take the loan out. So lots of things to consider, but the loan provision is one of these unique type of benefits that I'd say most 401k plans probably do provide.
Sure. And then another consideration too, is the cost of management and then the administration of these plans as well. And it could be higher or lower than potentially an IRA. Again, it's plan specific. Certain plans negotiate certain investments that have different underlying expense ratios. And let's talk about that for a sec too, because a lot of times when you have a plan, you're limited to a certain number of investment options. Those investment options, while you might not necessarily see a specific line item charge on your 401k statement, those investment choices will often have underlying expenses. So understanding each of the investment options, but then also the costs associated or what those underlying expenses are, is paramount to consider because they're costs at the end. And then, Tom, do you want to talk about that? Sometimes there are those administrative charges as well.
Sure. So in my experience with 401k plans, there's typically a couple different service providers involved, and you would have a pension consultant firm who's responsible for plan design, plan testing, right? Annual requirements to make sure that the plan is in compliance with federal and state law. And then you would have a record keeper involved with making sure that they're keeping track of whose contributions is whose, making sure that it gets invested according to the participants' wishes, right? And then typically there's an investment advisor providing guidance on the investment selections, providing education. And those providers obviously charge fees for services, and depending on how the plan document agreement is written up, employers sometimes pay that cost from employer dollars, and sometimes they share some of that cost where participants are charged either a portion of that fee or maybe even more of that right from their accounts. So the Department of Labor over the years has heard more from participants across the country in terms of providing more transparency on this fee disclosure and level of fees that, let's say, participants are responsible for. And the good news is that today, those fees are required to be disclosed on statements. And so if you're a participant in the plan and you're reviewing your statement, you can look for those fee disclosures and see, if you are being charged for some of those service providers and the work that they're doing for the plan. So that's
Right.
That's one fee level to pay attention to. The other one was what you were just referring to, which is when you're making decisions about which investments you want to be allocating to and investing in. When you log on to the provider, that you can drill into each of those fund options and take a look at expense ratios and in addition to performance and things like that.
Right. So those administrative charges are sometimes more transparent when you're looking at the statement, but those investment options and those underlying expense ratios sometimes aren't as obvious, and that's where you got to drill down a little bit. So you get a feeling for the total cost of, the plan options and being in the plan.
And I would say that the good news for participants in these types of plans across the country is that the overall cost has been trending lower and lower and lower. And that's obviously a benefit for plan participants. So, overall fees, for, I don't have any data right now to quote, but overall fees have generally been trending lower over the last, several years when it comes to 401k plan assets.
Well, that's great. Every bit helps, right?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the individual, right? That, maybe still working at an older age, and doesn't need funds to live on from the 401k. They're still working, and as we know, with traditional IRAs and IRA rollovers, there's something called required minimum distributions, right? And required minimum distributions is essentially that minimum annual amount that you need to take out of these IRA accounts and pre-tax funds that are mandated. Otherwise, you have a penalty above certain ages, right? And if you're born before 1960, that age is 73. And if you're born after 1960, that age that you have to start taking required minimum distributions is 75. But with 401ks, there's this neat feature that, hey, if you're still working above required minimum distribution age, and if you're not a 5% owner or more of the company, you don't need to take required minimum distributions. Now, this isn't the case in all plans. Some plans still mandate that you take a required minimum distribution. I've seen that. But some plans might allow you to pass on the required minimum distribution if you're above RMD age. And now this might make sense to leave the funds in a 401k if your plan says, hey, even though you're of RMD age, you don't need to take a required minimum distribution if you're less than a 5% owner. And for someone who doesn't need to take the funds, and maybe there aren't other tax planning reasons to distribute funds, then hey, leave the accounts pre-tax, have them keep growing. So that might be a reason to keep it within the 401k vessel.
Absolutely. And to your point, this is obviously an individual decision. Every circumstance and client scenario is a little bit different, but it is it's a interesting provision that 401ks do provide that unlike IRAs.
So required minimum distributions might not be required if you are still active within your 401k plan and under a 5% owner of the company. If you are terminated from service, that goes out the window, and required minimum distributions would be required from a 401k. But if you're still active and not a 5% owner, you might not need to take required minimum distributions. But it's going to depend on the plan. Like everything, it's plan contingent. So make sure you review with your plan administrator if this might be a reason why you would keep funds in a 401k and you're still active. You want to grab this one? This is,
Sure.
I feel like this is one of your favorites.
Well, so we've spent how many episodes have we put together so far on the topic of Roth IRAs? It's been a few.
At least 3, maybe 4, right?
Exactly. So for those that share a passion for the Roth IRA and Roth 401k world like we do, we have more to share when it comes to the advantages of leaving funds in a 401k. And that would be this provision of what we refer to as a backdoor Roth IRA conversion. And we had previously had an episode about how the rules work for this. And what we wanted to point out today is if you are a taxpayer in a situation where you want to get dollars into a Roth IRA in terms of making contributions on an annual basis, the IRS has limits on who can do that depending on your taxable income. And once your income is above certain levels, you're not allowed to make a direct contribution to a Roth IRA. But there is a way to get dollars in there by essentially taking an extra step. And that extra step would be you would make a contribution to a traditional IRA first and then convert those dollars to a Roth IRA. And that contribution to the traditional IRA, again, assuming this individual is above those income limits set by the IRS, that would typically be a non-deductible IRA contribution, and then you would convert. The issue is if you already have dollars in your IRA, the way that the rules work is there's this pro rata rule where if I'm making a maximum $7,500 IRA contribution in 2026, or if I'm 50 years old and older, I could make an $8,600 maximum contribution to my IRA. And I want to convert all those dollars over to a Roth IRA. If I already have dollars in my IRA account, I have to factor in the value of those dollars when I make the conversion. And so therefore, a portion of that conversion would be taxable income to me. If instead I didn't have dollars in my IRA and I had those dollars in my 401k, I could do this backdoor Roth conversion, and the dollars in my 401k are essentially invisible. They are not counted in this pro rata rule. So in a quick example, if I already have $500,000 in my IRA and I was trying to do this backdoor Roth conversion, I have to factor in that $500,000. But instead, if that $500,000 was in my 401k and my traditional IRA was zero, that's a nice clean way to be able to do the backdoor Roth conversion and not have to worry about having a tax impact on the transaction.
Great explanation. And so essentially, once you get money into that IRA bucket, that's when it becomes visible for this backdoor Roth feature. So if someone's interested in doing that, maybe keeping the funds in the 401k might make sense. Another factor to kind of, think about and consider and put on that checklist to look at. And then there's this rule of 55, right? So in a 401k, let's say you leave the employer and you're 55 years old, instead of 59 and a half, like in a IRA, it's 55 here, and that early 10% penalty is actually lifted for distributions. And there could be, the age could even be younger, as low as 50 for certain public safety employees in different types of plans. But rule of 55 here for, 401k plans. And again, always review with, plan administrator. But this might be important and might be a consideration for someone wanting to leave funds in a 401k if you're terminating employment and you're in between that 55 and 60 age and need to take distributions to live on. Because if you need to take distributions and you're younger than 59 and a half in an IRA account, you might be looking at not only, tax as ordinary income, but then that additional 10% penalty in a traditional IRA. Whereas if you kept the funds in a 401k, as long as you're 55, you could potentially, that 10% penalty would be abolished. Now, there is that 72T consideration, right, for an IRA account, which is those substantially equal payments. But let's say, you're 58, the rule there with 72T, it's 5 years or 59 and a half where you have to continue to take those substantially equal payments, but 5 years or 59 and a half, whichever is longer. So let's say you're 58, you need to take distributions from your, pre-tax IRA. You might, even if you stopped needing the funds at 60 and had done the substantially equal payments, you might then be mandated to continue taking those distributions to, avoid potential penalties. So just another kind of food for thought is, another line item to consider here. And I think what a lot of this illustrates, Tom, is that every situation's different. And every plan's different, right? So really reviewing with your plan administrator, your financial advisor, your CPA, as to what might make best sense for your situation.
Well said. Absolutely. You just got to make sure you're understanding what the rules are and what what situation would be best for you. So let's chat a little bit, Kate, here about so what do a lot of 401k investors do? Let's say if they retire or they change jobs, if and they have dollars in a 401k, and they think about some of their options and they want to keep it in the tax deferred, bubble, right? It's a lot of people do roll over dollars from a 401k to an IRA. And so we wanted to chat a little bit about the differences here when it comes to IRAs versus 401ks for investors.
Right. And why, an individual might consider rolling over 401k funds into an IRA as opposed to keeping it, with a 401k. And so, one of the first things that comes to mind, and kind of alluded to it earlier today, is the number of investment options that might be available in an IRA relative to a 401k. So as mentioned, when you're in a 401k, the plan often will have a set number of investment choices. Some plans do a great job of offering a wider range of investment choices at great, affordable expense ratios, but not all plans are created equal. So really looking at the underlying investment choices that are available to you in the 401k and comparing that to what might be available in an IRA. And really in an IRA, you do get usually a wider range of investment choices, but costs will be different considering what you're looking to do in the IRA and what's available to you in the 401k. So really making sure that you're reviewing all the options, all the choices, and considering that as food for thought when making this decision.
Yeah, I would add that there are some plans. So we're talking about the the availability of making different types of investment decisions. Let's say in a 401k versus an IRA, and I would say to your point, the vast majority of 401ks stick to a menu, right? A menu of options to choose from, and that might range from 10 options to maybe 20, right? It used to be a whole lot more. A lot of the menus have been consolidated because a lot of investors were, providing some feedback that the list was too long and it was hard to make investment decisions and things like that. So, I think 401k plan providers have tried to focus on, more focused investment menus. But some plans do offer an option for participants to essentially break outside of the menu and have a brokerage link account type of thing, where essentially you don't have to be selecting from a menu. You can make your own unique investment choices if the plan offers that type of a feature. So just wanted to make a quick note that not every plan sticks to a set menu of items. Some plans do offer this added feature where essentially, you're still within the 401k umbrella for your company, but you're allowed to essentially create your own investments if the plan does provide such an opportunity.
It's a great clarification. And also continuing just to highlight as well that, every plan's different. Your investment choices, your available options, what you're able to do still within the bounds of the plan, all can vary greatly.
Yeah, and I think that also feeds into the preferences that participants have when it comes to investing. We've met plenty of participants over the years that either they're not very interested in investing, they haven't been educated very well, they're just very, very busy doing what they do for the company, and they're happy that the 401k provides well diversified options. There's a lot of these target date retirement funds
Sure.
that have become much more popular over the last decade plus or so. But then there's a lot of investors out there that do prefer they do their own research. They want to be investing in certain areas of the market, and they want to avoid other areas of the market. And I think investing style is a part of this decision, right? And if I'm somebody who really enjoys researching the market and knows where I want to be invested, wants to take advantage of different opportunities that I've been reading about or learning about, any plan that might offer these brokerage windows, if you will, would be, could be a good fit for an investor like that. And then from an IRA standpoint, an IRA is essentially it's another account, and an investor can then choose how they want to invest within that IRA, depending on what their objectives are. So I'd say the investment universe is something to pay attention to, depending on what kind of investment style you adhere to.
Exactly. And IRAs might potentially offer greater flexibility if there's an advisor that you're working with and having a managed account, something like that as well. So we touched on fees already. We really got to pay attention to the fees on both sides of the equation, on the 401k side as well as the IRA. One great feature that I think IRAs offer is that kind of logistical simplicity. Sometimes just being able to kind of give you that more autonomy and being able to rebalance as you need and when you want, kind of thing as well. And then even just taking funds out, right? When you become of RMD age, some investors find it easier, on the IRA side than the 401k side, but that's not always the case. Everyone's experience is a little different there, but that logistical side sometimes can be a little simpler on the IRA front.
Yeah. In terms of things like making a decision to make a withdrawal from an IRA versus a 401k type of thing?
Exactly.
Yeah. I would say if we want to, essentially comment on that a little bit, typically in a 401k plan, while you're still working there, making withdrawals from the plan are typically limited, right? There are hardship provision withdrawals, and there's guidelines in terms of what qualifies for a hardship withdrawal. There's that loan provision we talked about before, but I'd say generally speaking, while you're working for a company actively, the 401k plan typically doesn't allow distributions for participants. And I'd say from an IRA standpoint, it's up to the IRA investor whether they are in a situation where they feel like they need to take a distribution or they want to for whatever reason. It's entirely up to that IRA account owner, right? And I'd say as long as the investor is aware of what the rules are and the consequences from a tax standpoint, right? Any penalty situation depending on their age. There's just there can be some more flexibility when it comes to making those distribution decisions from an IRA versus a 401k. Not that we're recommending distributions early from an IRA, but it is possible for sure. Yeah.
Right. I've said this before, but I don't even like surprises on my birthday, nonetheless tax surprises. So making sure to be mindful of what lies ahead in terms of the tax picture when taking distributions.
Sure.
And then, we've seen clients that have multiple 401k accounts, and it's hard to get a clear picture of, when you're the individual, how you're positioned. So sometimes consolidating multiple 401ks allows you an easier job of monitoring your positioning, and how you're investing. So just from a monitoring and management standpoint, sometimes consolidating can make a lot of sense. If you have multiple 401ks, consolidating into a rollover IRA might make it easier on that side.
Yeah, well, I mean, visibility, I think, is an important aspect of managing finances. And, I say visibility, and what I'm thinking about is, if I'm an investor, these days it's nice to be able to log in and see, multiple accounts. Typically folks have multiple types of accounts that they're investing in. It's nice to be able to see that in one place. The good news is today there's software out there that lets you aggregate and be able to log in and see investments, even if they're at different institutions and things like that. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of competition in the 401k space. 401k providers that an employer uses can change, right? They go through, some sort of periodic review of what they're doing, and they decide to make some adjustments to who they're using and whatnot. So, it's not unusual to, for a 401k participant to move from one provider to the next provider. And it's just important to make sure that, everybody understands what they have and where it is.
That's a good side note too, is, sometimes when you have a 401k account and you have these multiple accounts, just let's say you move, you've got to keep everybody up to date as well, right? You got to keep, the plan administrator needs to know where to send any notifications and whatnot. So, just from a simplicity standpoint, sometimes less is more. And then, on the beneficiary side, Tom, I know you've had some thoughts on this as well. You want to dig into that a little?
Sure. In terms of, when people are choosing who do I select to be the beneficiary of these assets should something happen to me, right? If you think about your classic, typical case, it might be a married couple where, one spouse names the other spouse as their 100% primary beneficiary, right? That's pretty straightforward. And that's typical in a, let's say a married couple situation. Pretty straightforward, not really complex. And 401k plans are, very easy to deal with. When you're enrolling in the 401k plan, choosing a beneficiary is one of the responsibilities that a participant has, right? And, one of the things that we just wanted to chat about today is, if I have an IRA, and let's say I have a situation where the way that I want my beneficiary designation might be a little bit more complex than, let's say, naming a person, right? It might be more complex than naming my spouse. Maybe this is a second marriage for me, and I've consulted with my attorney, and I want to have a beneficiary designation that, let's say, is a little more complex, right? If this happens, then I want this person, to be a beneficiary of this portion of my retirement assets. So I'd say that custodians have been better over the years of allowing IRA owners to submit more complex beneficiary designations. Typically, we would see that where the estate attorney would be providing some guidance on the language of that beneficiary designation. Which is something, if that's an important objective for an investor that has dollars in a retirement account, just something to pay attention to. The other thing I would mention is, if I have a 401k and I'm working for that company, or even if I leave that company, that 401k is one account, right? It's just the one account that I've been saving in, and I have my beneficiary designation. And that could be for, let's say, one person, or maybe there's a 50-50 split, right, between two people, for example. If I have money in 401ks, let's say I've been thinking about ways to benefit maybe potentially family members that I want to inherit my assets. And maybe there's some charitable beneficiaries that I've been thinking about. There is more flexibility if you wanted to, let's say you have X amount of dollars in one IRA, and you wanted to include a charity as a beneficiary. It's pretty easy to say, listen, I'm going to open up another IRA. I'm going to roll assets over from my existing IRA to this new one. And for that new IRA, I'm going to choose the beneficiary to just be this charitable organization, right? So I know that I can control the beneficiaries just by essentially opening up a new IRA, doing a rollover, not a taxable event, and then leaving, let's say, loved ones as beneficiaries of the original IRA in whatever format I have. So
multiple buckets.
yeah, I would say it's just, there's some flexibility there where, you can open up as many IRAs as you want, really. And you can have different beneficiaries for each of them. And that might be a clean way for an investor to essentially build out a little bit more of a complex beneficiary puzzle, if you will.
Right. And not one size fits all there, right? Someone might be able to accomplish what they need to. But just another thought, really just to, that's a great example of, what's possible. And then the creditor protection, I know we highlighted that on the positive side of keeping funds in a 401k, but that is also afforded to rollover IRAs as long as they're funded from employer-sponsored plans like 401ks. So you still get that unlimited creditor protection in bankruptcy. Again, it's not for everything, but get that creditor protection as long as it's employer-sponsored funds that are going into the rollover IRA. Yeah. Traditional IRAs, fall under slightly different rules. There's still some protection there on the creditor side. It's not as generous. And the traditional IRAs can also be impacted by the state laws. So something to think about.
Yeah, exactly. I would say, depending on where you live, each state has their own, rules on the books when it comes to how much creditor protection they provide. So it is important for you to get familiar with that, depending on where you live. The one last thing I would add when it comes to this whole creditor protection topic would be post Secure Act. Inherited IRAs are no longer considered retirement accounts, so they don't share that creditor protection that your classic IRA or IRA rollover or 401k does still have.
Thank you for highlighting that. Thanks. Very, very good point. So we want to highlight some be carefuls here. I think if you do decide to roll over your 401k, just some additional things to consider before you roll. So before you roll, let's think about this stuff. In 401ks, remember there are different kind of tax treatments to different types of funds within that 401k. So you could have pre-tax funds, right, where you're getting that deduction in the year that you're making that contribution to that 401k plan. There are now also plans that have Roth 401k funds as well in within the plan. And then it's possible that there could also be after-tax funds that are in the 401k plans. So really being mindful of and working with your plan administrator on what type of funds are in my plan. And based on that, where do those funds need to land to avoid possible tax nightmares?
Yeah. So, I would say, and this is all, pull your statement. The details are now listed on your statement. You might have to leaf through to page 4 or 5 or 6 or so to see the details. But this is an important thing. The record keepers are keeping track of what's what based on what Kate just described. And the other thing I would say is that before let's say you're choosing to do a rollover, confirm what you're seeing on the statement with the plan provider. Make sure that you're understanding what's on there, so that when you do start to execute your rollovers, you know what's going to which type of an account.
Exactly. And, especially with pre-tax funds, right? You want to, if you're doing the rollover, you want to go directly, to an IRA rollover to try to avoid taxation on those pre-tax funds. Because that could be a tax nightmare, as we mentioned before. If you're taking a distribution of pre-tax funds, you could get hit with federal, state, and potentially early penalty withdrawals.
Yeah.
And then on those Roth 401k funds, right? making sure that we're honoring that tax bucket, and those Roth 401k funds could go to a Roth IRA. It's not always obvious, when you get that statement, you kind of look at just that general number, like, oh, okay, that's what my account value is worth. But you got to look at what's underlying, within those funds.
Yeah, if you worked hard enough to purposely make Roth 401k contributions, you want to make sure that those dollars are going into a Roth IRA once you do execute the rollover, so that the purposeful tactic that you took in order to take advantage of the Roth feature in your 401k gets to the right spot.
Right. And to enjoy all those, tax benefits that you've worked so hard for.
Right. And
then there's those after-tax funds. So for someone who maybe is participating in like a mega backdoor Roth type of strategy, paying attention there, working with the plan administrator, but most likely, that basis, could potentially go to a Roth IRA, but any earnings most likely will need to go to a rollover IRA.
And I think that highlights an issue that, if a participant isn't actively choosing to convert those after-tax dollars to the Roth inside the 401k, that's where you get this earnings that aren't, after tax. And you gotta pay attention to the difference there. So if you are taking advantage of these after-tax contributions, typically you want to take that next step and make sure you're converting that to the Roth inside the 401k.
Exactly. And I think we have a really nice pod too on taxation of Roth money as well. So that's kind of where, insert how a Roth IRA is potentially taxed.
That's right. Yeah.
To watch that one too, just for any hiccups, because remember there's that 5-year rule there and whatnot. So, make sure you give that one a watch.
And Kate, I just wanted to add one more thing before we get to the next little provision here, is that just something to keep in mind. Again, if you're rolling from a 401k to an IRA, for the most part, from what I've seen, is that a lot of these 401k plan providers, they will convert those investments that are in the 401k, they'll sell them, and so you're going to be rolling cash over from the 401k to the IRA. And so there could be a period of time where you're not invested in the different parts of the market that the 401k used to be invested in. Cash gets rolled over to the IRA, and then you have to decide, how you want those dollars to be reinvested. So, depending on, what the timing looks like, that's just one thing to pay attention to is to confirm that the 401k provider is going to sell these assets, move them to cash, and then do the rollover from there.
Tom, it's an excellent point. I actually had a conversation with someone yesterday on that. Yeah. And so essentially, you could be taken out of the market as well for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And that could work in your favor or not. Obviously, you can't time the market. That's hard, but it's definitely something to be aware of. So it's an excellent point. And then we're not going to get too deep into this because this is a big topic within itself. But I think with net unrealized appreciation, NUA, I think the real thing that people need to be aware of on this particular topic is, hey, this is a flashing red sign. If you have appreciated employer stock in your employee, your retirement plan, this should be a flashing red light. Slow down. Don't roll over your funds, because there could be a potential tax savings for how you treat this particular type of rollover when you hold these employer securities within your retirement plan. And you have to do this before you roll over. If you've rolled over, it's too late. So if you do hold employer stock in your plan, this is something that you need to consider before.
Yeah. And perhaps we do another separate episode on NUA, but because we're not going to get into it today, but it's a special tax feature for these types of participants that have appreciated employer stock. And, it could be a good solution, or, once you run the numbers, it may not be a big benefit. You gotta look at your particular case to see if this is something that's worth exploring. But Kate, to your point, yes, if you are somebody that has employer appreciated stock in your 401k, check this out before you do a rollover. Just see if it might make sense for your situation.
Right. Because it could just save you some tax dollars.
Right.
If you just do the math. So another one is just the logistics of how you do this 401k rollover into an IRA and things you need to think about. So oftentimes, as we mentioned, you want to go directly to that IRA. You want to do a direct trustee to trustee transfer of the funds, whereas you do not take possession of the funds. So how this might look is you contact your plan administrator and you say, hey, I'd like to do a rollover into my IRA. The plan administrator sends you the forms and you complete the forms and essentially, indicating this is going to my IRA account at so-and-so custodian, and you're mailing it to the custodian, or you're doing a direct, a wire, or however they're sending the funds, but it's going from the plan to the new IRA custodian. This way, you avoid that potential taxation, whereas pre-tax funds become taxable.
Yeah. And I'd say more employers are, they're up to speed on this method of rolling over. And you'll see that when you see the form, Kate, that you were describing, which is great. And this would be our guidance would be, if you're doing a rollover, make sure you're letting them know, listen, I already have an IRA. Here's where it's located. Here's the account number. You list all that stuff on the form, and you just make sure that the rollover qualifies as this direct trustee to trustee transfer.
Exactly. And sometimes, the plan administrator will mail the participant the check, but the check will be payable to the IRA, and then you've got to deposit the check.
Yeah, and that highlights that timing element we were talking about before, right? It, depending on how quickly they process the rollover request, a lot of times they'll say, okay, great, thanks very much. We're processing your distribution request, and they could say that that typical, this could take 5 to 7 to 10 business days, right, for you to expect to see your check in the mail, like things like that, because they want to manage expectations. But some of these plan providers can allow for an electronic transfer, where they cut down on the time that it takes for dollars to get from the 401k to the IRA. And I'd say that would be worth exploring just to see if that's an option. That could be a way to kind of cut down on the time it takes to get the dollars from the 401k to the IRA.
It's a great point. You got to get the money working for you. So, and then there's the 60-day rollover rule. And this one's a little tricky. So this one is if you were to, have essentially the funds distributed outright, you have 60 days to then deposit into an IRA. So this one, you got to watch out for, because you're only allowed one of these per year, per individual. And if you don't get the funds into an IRA within this 60-day window, they could become taxable. And again, that's a big caution sign flashing, because as we know, pre-tax funds, are taxed at ordinary income rates when they're distributed. And then again, if you're before 59 and a half, if you're younger than 59 and a half, you could also have that potential early withdrawal penalty as well. So something to be careful about, so really being sensitive to, not only considering, hey, should I roll over these funds, but how am I rolling over these funds? And oftentimes, if you want to keep it within that pre-tax vessel or within that retirement account vessel and get it directly to the custodian, doing that direct trustee to trustee transfer.
Yeah. It highlights, the importance of doing the homework before you execute the rollover. And I think that, there's also another thing to, I think, highlight with the 60-day rollover rule. If you do get that check, lump sum distribution, where let's say you're intending to roll it over to an IRA and you don't want it to be a taxable event, employers could have some mandatory tax withholding on that distribution, which means that you're not getting 100% of the dollars that are in your pre-tax 401k, for example. And if you wanted to get all those dollars into an IRA within that 60-day window, you would need to come up with the money that was withheld for taxes from other sources and get that money into the IRA, and that could be difficult depending on your liquidity.
Fantastic point, for sure. So I think we've highlighted a lot of food for thought for individuals. And again, the one thing we really want to focus on here too is that every plan is different. Every individual's needs and situation is different. So really reviewing your situation, your needs with your plan administrator, with your financial advisor, with your CPA, and really craft a plan that makes the most sense for you considering your individual situation.
Well said. And I would say, going back to some of the comments we made at the beginning of our discussion today, if you think that you might have an old 401k lying around out there somewhere, do your research, find where those dollars are, and you can make a decision on what you want to do. With dollars that are in let's say a former, could be a plan from 3 or 4 jobs ago, right? What was the stat, Kate, on the how many times U.S. workers change jobs between the ages of I think it was 25 and 58 or something like that?
I think it was 13 jobs. 13
yeah, I was going to say it was in the teens. Yeah,
between the ages of 18 and 58. So that could be a lot of 401k funds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other thing I think that the pandemic highlighted was, the different employers' rules for, remote working and things like that. And I think there's folks out there that are, saying, oh, listen, I can do the same type of work at this company, and they have a different policy for when I have to actually be in the office versus not, or how much of a commute I'm going to have. And so I think that's helping to also, increase the number of folks that are changing jobs. And that could impact, the amount of dollars that are in these former 401k plans that may or may not be invested the way that people want them to, right? I think the good news, one of the things that was interesting about that research, Kate, about the dollars that are in these old 401k plans,
Department of Labor, lost and found.
So one of the things was, well, why would so many dollars be in these former 401k plans? Well, number one was what we just talked about. People, essentially jumping from one employer to the next employer, right? Looking for better opportunities. And the other thing is the advent of this auto enrollment feature to 401k plans, where participants may not completely realize that they are contributed to the 401k plan. And this is one of those things that, it developed over the years where, there was several situations where, let's say, participants in 401k plans were making contributions, but let's say you were one of those investors that, had a hard time making a decision in terms of how you wanted to invest it. Typically, back then, your dollars would get into the plan, but they might just be sitting in the money market, right? And so you might look at your statement a year or two later, and you say to yourself, well, how come my account didn't grow? It's been sitting in cash this whole time, and that's a big reason why a lot of these target date funds were implemented, and they became a qualified default investment option for participants that wouldn't make a decision. So at least your dollars would be invested, they'd be diversified, they'd be aligned with how old you were and typically how long a U.S. worker would work before retirement and things like that. So that auto enrollment feature, while I like it from a standpoint of making sure that dollars are getting allocated into the 401k, they're getting invested, right? And that compounding feature happens over time, which is so powerful. But I guess if, depending on, how busy you are and whatnot, you may not realize that you were in the plan. Yeah.
Unless you're opening that paycheck and seeing, oh my gosh, hey, I am contributing to my 401k.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting.
You're unaware.
Think about why these dollars are in some of these older plans. So, so anyway,
make sure you check that Department of Labor Lost and Found website for the 401k funds.
Absolutely.
And thank you to all of our listeners for joining today. Be sure to like, subscribe, and meet us back here soon.
Thanks very much.